Amnesia: The Dark Descent is definitely regarded as a classic in the horror genre for games, and it's easy to see why. There isn't much like it out there, even after it's been out for over 10 years now. In March earlier this year, Frictional announced the new Amnesia game titled Amnesia Rebirth, which would make it the third game in the Amnesia franchise and the first title being released in over 7 years. To pay homage to this event, I thought it would be interesting to draw a parallel between the two original Amnesia titles, the celebrated Dark Descent and the controversial Machine for Pigs. I remember upon release, the Steam reviews for Machine for Pigs, along with a few user scores on certain websites, were mixed all over the place, with many people being disappointed about the changes that were made to the sequel. The easy answer for this is that the sequel wasn't developed by the same team who developed Dark Descent. But even so, I think these two games have a lot more in common than people think, which is what I aim to prove today. I'm going to be dividing the rest of this video into several sections, so if you wish, you can skip over what doesn't interest you. Section 1 is going to be a quick summary of both stories, which will be a nice refresher if you haven't played the games in a while, or informative if you've never touched them in your life. Section 2 is going to be an explanation of how both games instill fear, which is important in connecting them later on. Section 3 is just going to be me taking a quick dump on Machine for Pigs, just a quick one, just to kind of harp on the stuff that could have improved to make this an even more connected experience. And for the final section, I'm going to finally tie them together and make my case. Alright, let's get started. The Dark Descent begins with you waking up in a dark castle with, drumroll please, amnesia. You wander around a bit hearing ungodly sounds all around you and witness a few unsettling events. Right before your character begins to have a stress-induced heart attack, you find a note written by somebody named Daniel, who turns out to be the person you're playing as. The note states that he intentionally gave himself the amnesia by drinking a mixture so he would forget everything he knows, and gives himself the objective of traveling, aka descending, Castle Brennenburg to get to the Inner Sanctum to kill some asshole named Alexander. The note doesn't really explain why Alexander is such an asshole, but you go along with it anyways. You progress through the castle on what should be a 20-minute journey tops, but ends up taking about 8 hours because everything in front of you is broken and shit keeps falling in your way. Out of nowhere, you begin to encounter these absolute abominations of stitched together things that can kill you, and this noise plays when they chase you. As you progress towards the bottom of the castle, you begin to regain some of your memories and recover bits of your journal, which begin to stitch the story together. Daniel was on an archaeological expedition in Algeria with a team when he became trapped in a dark tunnel in which he found a mysterious orb. He touches it and experiences some dark, mesmerizing stuff inside of his head. He's fascinated by the experience, so he keeps the pieces that the orb shattered into and tries to find anybody else who knows about the orb and can inform him. Every researcher he visits ends up dying later because of this shadow that's following Daniel that seems like it was unleashed by the orb being misplaced. This troubles Daniel a bit, and he feels responsible for their deaths. He becomes more frantic, and one day he gets a note from a baron in a castle called Castle Brennenburg, who states he can help Daniel, so Daniel travels there and triggers the series of events that lead to the start of the game. Daniel's journal becomes more frantic as Alexander promises he can banish the shadow as long as Daniel listens to him. This involves giving sacrifices to the shadow, murdering people, and torturing a few prisoners, who Daniel was informed were all horrible criminals. Spoiler alert, that's not true, most of them were innocent. Daniel finally opens his eyes later on and realized that Alexander influenced him to become a cold-blooded piece of trash murderer, and he couldn't handle that information, so he took the amnesia mixture after leaving the note for himself. Alexander also has malicious intentions with the orb, as he manipulated Daniel into giving it to him, so he wants to open a door to another world. Back in the present, you continue to fix broken shit to progress, and eventually these abominations are replaced by these abominations who can kill you in one hit. You endure, and eventually make it to this abomination named Agrippa, who was a former associate of Alexander who's being kept alive by some sort of concoction. He asks if you go to the Inner Sanctum to take him with you, as Alexander's mind has become tainted and Agrippa still knows the right thing to do with the orb. This begins an unofficially stated side quest that lets you find ingredients to make a concoction that will keep Agrippa alive if you cut his head off. You can choose to find these ingredients or go to the Inner Sanctum by yourself. You finally arrive to see Alexander ass-naked floating in the air. There's 3 different endings here. You can either do nothing, stand there like a dumbass, and let Alexander escape and allow the shadow to consume you. Why would you do that? Why is this even an ending? You can topple the pillars to stop Alexander opening the portal, and the shadow consumes him instead, and Daniel escapes the castle having taken his revenge. This is known as the revenge ending. However, if you did the side quest and bring Agrippa's head with you, you can wait for Alexander to open the portal, throw Agrippa's head in, and the portal will close. The shadow consumes Alexander, and it appears that Daniel dies, but there's a short cutscene afterwards, with Agrippa voicing over it, and he intends to save Daniel in his enlightened state, and this is generally seen as the good ending.
Don't worry, Daniel. It will be all right.
After that severe oversimplification of the story, let's move on to Machine for Pigs. The game begins with you waking up in a bed with, drumroll please, amnesia. You walk around this big-ass house, hearing ungodly sounds all around you and witnessing a few unsettling events. Some mysterious man ends up speaking to you through a phone, where you learned your name is Oswald Mandis, and that your children are trapped below in this giant machine underground. Unlike the journals in the first game, Mandis writes down in his journal real-time as events progress. As you move on, you learn that you are the creator of this machine, but are still unsure of its function. Out of nowhere, you begin to be chased by these abominations, who actually aren't as scary and a bit slower than these abominations. Just like Dark Descent, all this shit is broken and you have to keep fixing it. Your character notes how these mechanisms were intentionally sabotaged, and there is someone trying to prevent you from reaching your children. Occasionally, you'll encounter the voice on the phone again, where he urges you on, and keeps letting you know that your children are close to death, so you need to hurry your ass up. Notes are the primary way the background of the story is told this time around. You can learn that the function of the machine seems to be to create these man-pigs for a still unknown reason. You can also learn about Mandis' wife and her death, along with a trip he took to Mexico in search of an orb that he found out about from documents retrieved from a place called Castle Brennenburg. You also learn that Vitae and these abominations were extracted from the castle as well to be experimented on, so this is where the connection between the two games presents itself story-wise. You end up successfully restarting this abomination of a machine, and begin to hear the phone guy laugh maniacally and give his evil speech because he's actually so very evil.
I live. I breathe again. I rise. I will rise to bleach the sky and still the water. I will spin the world wheel and set the future upon the path to redemption.
Where are my children? You promised me my children!
It turns out he manipulated you into restarting the machine so he can commence their grand plan of unleashing these man-pigs into the streets of London with the goal of slaughtering everyone. That's right, the machine was basically just a pig army creation device. Mandis starts losing his shit and is in disbelief about the abominations he's created, and he doesn't understand why his pre-amnesia self would have done this.
This is not what I meant! This is not what I meant at all!
Luckily, the villain begins giving evil poetic speeches about how society is so terrible and people are so corrupt and evil that they may as well be pigs, so it was his and Oswald's mission to create this machine that would sort of cleanse society. Mandis begins to remember that he was actually the saboteur all along, and he was previously trying to sabotage the machine in a feverish haze. You go back down to complete your mission and begin to destroy the machine you've created. The voice on the phone actually does not approve of this idea, and he tries to stop you with some more abominations. You end up coming across this heart being held up being a not-so-subtle heart of the machine, which implies it has its own sentience, and remove it, which begins the machine's destruction. As you progress towards the end of the game, the voice then reveals all of the truth. Now, excuse anything that I get wrong here, because it looks like this ending has a few different interpretations. To my understanding, the voice and Oswald appear to be the same person, and represent the two parts of his fractured psyche. There's regular Oswald Mandis, the person you're playing as, who's more kind-hearted, and then there's the machine version of him, who's talking to you on the phone the whole game, and is also given the pseudonym The Engineer. The reason his mind appears to be split into two parts all started with the death of his wife, which made him start to look at the world like everything was a piece of shit. He ended up taking his kids to this Mexico expedition, and upon finding the orb, he saw what would happen after the turn of the century, aka the 1900s. The orb showed his children dying in World War I, only a decade from that point. And Oswald was in such disbelief that mankind could be so unforgiving and so cruel, He goes crazy and unbelievably and cruelly kills his own children to prevent their future deaths. It's a 500 IQ move right there. So once again, the conflict in this game is because of these orb artifacts. Once he returns from Mexico, Mandus has fully embodied this edgy persona and becomes the guy you hear on the phone, the engineer. He begins to build his machine and he intends to raise the entire world with his pigmen. However, at some point he played himself, because he gets a moment of clarity where he realizes what an asshole he's been and tries to disrupt his own machine. He's overcome by a great fever, runs all the way back to his house, and collapses in the bed at the start of the game. His amnesia wasn't created from a mixture, but him awakening into his kinder sense of self, who wants to find his children who he's forgotten he's killed. This sort of harkens back to the first game, where Agrippa mentions that the orb parts can leak madness almost, and it almost seems like the orb in this case created Mandus into a completely different person. Unfortunately, by the start of the game, the machine has its own sentience, so at the end of the game when Mandus remembers everything, he's overcome with regret, and he sacrifices himself to destroy the machine in what appears to be an Aztecian temple deep underground, likely to represent the one in Mexico where he found the orb. It's unclear whether all of these events are actually real, or just a journey of self-realization in Mandus' psyche. Alright, I'm done with these storylines. Let's take a look at how these games dish out the spooks. Both of these games are effective in the way they induce fear, because they tap into the classic human dread of fearing the unknown. Okay, well, Machine for Pigs kind of fucked it up a little bit, but that's for the next section. For now, let's look at the similarities. Both games begin with you waking up without knowing where you are, and without a clear objective. They kind of let you wander by yourself for a while before spelling out the objective for you, so you're treading lightly because you aren't sure if there's any threats to you while you're walking around. Both of the games play those ungodly noises I mentioned earlier off in the distance, so you can hear that something is wrong in these scenarios. In The Dark Descent, it's the hissing of the shadow, the cries of pain, and the grunts from the enemies you'll be facing later. In Machine, it's these ear-piercing sounds of machinery in the distance, grunts and oinks of the enemies you'll be facing later, and the pleas of your unknowingly dead children. That's probably the creepiest one.
We're hiding, Daddy.
I think both of these games do the beginnings really well because you're just clueless enough that you're a bit scared to progress. The enemies are done pretty well because both of them set the enemies upon you without a clear warning. The first time you're chased in The Dark Descent, you'll likely hear the noise first and not realize what's happening until it's too late and now there's a fresh batch of urine heading down your pant legs. Machine also doesn't inform you when the threat begins, but it's a bit more clear because the pig gives a ferocious roar in your face before it begins chasing you. The enemy placement can be a bit questionable in both games at times, but I'm pretty sure that was done so you can never expect when to run into them, which is still an effective fear tactic. It seems like horror games nowadays give you plenty of time to understand when you're about to be chased by something, and I kind of wish it was more abrupt. Another method these games use to increase their spook score is to present societal problems involved with the situation surrounding you, making them both ugly and horrifying. Both of them involve the death of innocents, the death of people who the antagonists deem unworthy to live, the rabble, the criminals. In Dark Descent, it's Alexander claiming that everyone he captures is a criminal, but he really just is trying to justify the ends to his own selfish means. Whereas in Machine, the engineer version of Mandus views the rabble as unproductive members of society, and one of the reasons it's collapsing. So, Mandus ends up unironically becoming a cruel and selfish leader. Dark Descent does this cool thing where it shows you real torture devices used on people, which are just brutal to say the least, along with some sound effects that are just too good at painting the image of bones breaking or someone's guts spilling out and all that fun stuff. Machine paints the picture of the torturous experience of going through this machine, a lot of it being an assembly line almost, being transformed into an uncontrolled abomination. And as seen in the game, these creatures are actually capable of thinking for themselves, they're just conditioned to be hostile. Imagine having your subconscious trapped in a man-pig body, being unable to control your actions, but still being barely alive on the inside. It doesn't sound like a comfortable weekend on the couch, exactly. For now, I'm just pointing out how the games are parallel in the way they present fearful scenarios to the player, almost in a similar order, along with dark thoughts. Unfortunately, before I keep tying the threads together, I think it's important to recognize the shortcomings of Machine for Pigs in order to fully appreciate how they tie together. So, let's just take a quick dump on it, okay? Let me ask you a personal question. This is a test of your aptitude, your wit, and your reflexes. What do you see on the screen right now? Alright, if your answer is fucking nothing, then you've just uncovered the greatest atrocity this game commits. I actually think the issues I'm about to talk about contribute to the duality of these games, because all of the issues in the original game are still here and made even worse. In the original, whenever Daniel has a flashback, the whole screen gets filled by the brightest white light ever known to mankind. It does and always will sear through my very eyes and incinerate my corneas. The white light was removed in the sequel. Instead, whenever Mandus has a flashback, he becomes completely trashed off his ass, and all of the dark colors on the screen start blending into each other to create this amalgamation of everything that's evil in the world plastered onto your monitor. What's with this blue tint there is to everything? Instead of darkness, it's just blue. The environments would have been far more affected if they just left them dark. The monsters are too slow and they aren't big enough. In the original, I always felt like the monsters were right on my heels. In this one, they give you ample time to notice the pursuer and just walk away. The feeling of dread is also dampened because you can look at the pigmen all you want, whereas the sanity mechanic in the original prevented you from staring at the creatures and realizing how derpy they actually are. Not allowing you to have a proper look at the enemy creates a much more tense and unpredictable environment. These are all small changes that could have made the sequel much better. Let's take a reverse dump real quick. A lot of people are quick to point out how short the sequel is compared to its predecessor. The completion time for Machine is roughly 3 to 4.5 hours, whereas Dark Descent is roughly 6 to 8 hours. Dark Descent definitely has more content. However, there's also a lot of crap that gets in your way in Dark Descent, and backtracking, and every lever is broken. As I stated before, if everything wasn't conveniently in Daniel's way in the original, it would have probably had a runtime similar to the sequel. But backtracking isn't always bad, to each their own. Despite everything I just said, I still don't think Machine is an unworthy sequel, and the existence of these two stories are harmonious. So without further ado, let's tie these suckers together. The theme of both these stories, the roots of them that tie them to the same core, is showing how these people are affected by madness. Both of these characters go through similar stages of madness and fear before they have their epiphanies and realize the monsters they've become. The easiest answer to directly connect these two stories would be the orbs, as they're known to leak madness and drive anyone towards the irrational that comes into contact with them. These two characters do despicable things before the start of these games, but their malicious acts were driven by real, true fear, the kind that we all experience. In Daniel's case, it's fear of death and fear of the unknown. He was on a quest for self-preservation, and upon being filled with regret, shifts his focus towards revenge.
I hunted her down, and what is her life worth? How many lives can I take before I surrender my own? Sure, I would kill a murderer to save an innocent. But to kill an innocent, to save myself? A cold-blooded murderer.
Oswald Mandus fears the corruption of mankind, and losing his children, and even worse, he fears the fact that both of these things are inevitable. He succumbs to his fears and becomes the embodiment of irony, a relentless, murderous ruler over his machine of corruption. How does one react when they know their future?
But I have seen the future, your 20th century, and let me tell you this, a far greater slaughter awaits you there. I seek to save the world by blood now, before millions fall beneath history, pushed under by blade, bullet, and gas.
Obviously, there's a magical and spiritual element to these games, that being the orbs and the shadow that are sort of causing all of the chaos from behind the scenes, but they take the sideline to the dreadful realities that we play through here. Hierarchy is also something that both protagonists experience. They are both in positions where they have power over other human beings. In Daniel's case, he's in sort of a state of denial, where he's convinced himself that all of these people he's torturing are beneath him. They're horrible criminals that deserve to die. He's participating in the hierarchy of playing the role of a castle baron, putting his life in front of others in an act of preservation. Mandus' experience with hierarchy is more poetic, as his very name is meant to represent that of a corrupt ruler. His namesake, Oswald Mandus, is a clear reference to Ozymandias, a fictional corrupt ruler who, at one point, ruled a vast empire, but is now represented by a statue, reduced to rubble, surrounded by miles of desert and nothingness. The original poem by Percy Shelley reads, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare." This is the track Mandus puts himself on in his engineer persona. His grand plan is to reduce the world to rubble as its ruler. But what would he really be the ruler of in the end? Both Daniel and Mandus are punished for their participation of power, which result in the ugly situations they find themselves in. These two games are definitely mechanically different from each other in a variety of ways, but I'm firm in the belief that these stories they tell are harmonious and significant to show that monstrous creatures aren't the ones that pursue you, but they're the player characters. These stories are redemption arcs. Both of the characters are filled with regret and guilt after realizing what they've both done, and you as the player have to experience the psychological side effects of that. And it's all exemplified by the terrific voice acting and music presented in both games. Dark Descent is a classic, but it seems to be remembered for the effect it had on the internet at the time. Machine for Pigs is a quality story, a bit overzealous at times, but it's very well done. But that one seems to be remembered for just not shilling out the spooks enough. But I think both of these games deserve to be remembered as coming from a similar time and sending a similar message. Well, maybe they could have just made the pig monsters a little more than just pigs with legs.